Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels and I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in Southern Vermont.
And I'm Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. Good evening.
And a reminder to our viewers to call in with questions or thought-provoking ideas. We have a Facebook site and an email address. Our email is questions@letstalkvt.com, and our Facebook site is at facebook.com/letstalkvt. Good.
All right.
So a lot of press in the paper today about marijuana and legalizing and prevention.
Well, you were at the legislative breakfast, right? So I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about what you heard or seen.
Yeah, because there was a breakfast put on by the prevention folks with, for example, the Brattleboro Prevention Coalition, some folks from Bennington and Bellows Falls and Springfield area. And they brought together local legislators, so a number of senators and representatives from Windham County, Jeanette White, Becca Ballant.
That's our two senators.
That's our two senators, and I think also...
was Molly there?
Molly Burke was there, as was Valerie, and I'm forgetting the woman who took Dick Merritt's place. But so it was very well attended by the representatives there, and the prevention folks were talking about basic statistics around Vermont, around levels of drug use, particularly marijuana, but also alcohol and tobacco. And there's some concerning statistics that Vermont seems to use a higher amount of marijuana, for example, than adolescents or teenagers in other states. Also that we see even higher rates still than in Windham County as well.
Any other concerns they were talking about? Anything else that came up around alcohol use or anything like that they were worried about? Now this is a survey of children, right? High school kids they do every year?
Right, so the Youth Risk and Behavior Survey. It's done by the state of Vermont every 2 years. And they're looking at perceptions of risk, and they're looking at sort of what is the perception of availability, of easy access, as well as rates of use. I mean, one of the more concerning things they showed was looking at a number of, say, positive and negative sort of factors. For example, do students believe their teachers care about them? Do they believe that they're a contributing part of the community? And you saw that on these sort of positive indicators that the kids who didn't smoke had a higher level of, say, satisfaction in those areas, and kids that have smoked more than 20 times a month, or assumed daily, were less satisfied on those indicators.
Right.
And some other indicators too. I think Debbie Haskins had talked about this when she was on our show before. Is when you look at things like feeling depressed for 2 weeks, when you look at ideas of suicide, or if you look at kids who report making mostly A's and B's, then you see more use of marijuana and assume more use of alcohol as well. Then leads to say worse levels of or higher levels of these problematic qualities.
Yeah, and it's hard to to be fair. Which came first? Were they smoking a lot of pot and then they did poorly in school, or were they doing poorly in school and one of the ways they dealt with the feelings and everything else that went around with it was to smoke pot? And the same thing with home environment. Was it an influence of not just that they smoked before school, but they really got into the habit of smoking at home, and there was reasons for that. So, it's hard to say one causes the other, but if you looked at the numbers and you showed me the chart, it's so clear. The kids who aren't smoking pot really seem to have a better quality of life. The kids who are smoking a lot of pot seem to have much poorer quality of life, or at least different issues. And so, again, I'm not saying one caused the other, but you really need to acknowledge that. You need to understand that this is a risk factor. And so anyway, so that all those statistics are available where at
absolutely. The Vermont Department of Health has this information available online, and one of the things that the representatives from ADAP, Alcohol and Drug Abuse Prevention Programs, had mentioned was that there's a very high level of vetting around the statistics that the Vermont Department of Health is going to put on their website. So this would be not necessarily sort of the cherry picking of data that we see in the debates from the pro-marijuana and anti-marijuana folks, but things that are pretty much down the middle and very well supported and reasonable conclusions are found at that website.
I got to tell you, though, I'm very suspicious that I think sometimes if people repeat things often enough, it becomes a fact. Like if they keep saying it's going to reduce marijuana use, somehow people are really going to believe that. That by making it illegal, they're going to make it less so. You know, I just find that really hard to believe. I just, you know, but we'll see. I guess we'll see over time. And, you know, not to, well.
Well, you know, man, one of the interesting points, and again, as we know, I mean, like I said, Senator Jeanette White was there, and of course, we have different opinions.
Yep.
And you know, we're able to say to each other, you know, she's not going to change her mind. You know, we're not going to change our minds. But one thing that we did agree on, and again, I think, you know, I'm thinking about this based on your comment there of sort of chicken and egg, right? Is it sort of, you know, poor school performance and learning difficulties that lead to marijuana use, or say does marijuana use lead to these other issues? They're wrapped up in each other. We still need to sort out whether, you know, one is causing the other, whether there's, you know, more than a correlation there. But we both, despite our disagreements about the marijuana legalization issue, we both agree that the key to this is sort of what's the foundation of people doing well. You know, how does Vermont become a state where both, you know, youth and adults thrive? And that by itself, I think we know from experience, should decrease the use of drugs in general. Because people who are having a good life and a purposeful life don't tend to use drugs as much because of that.
I just wonder, you know, maybe we've gotten to a point now where if you can take a drug and it makes your life better and it makes you feel good, then it's okay to take it. You know what I mean? And maybe I'm just like old-fashioned. Maybe I'm just like from another generation, and I don't think that's a really valid way. But it could be, you know, I mean, you know, in 1984, I don't know. I mean, I just get sort of worried about that's sort of people are so busy trying to make the point that marijuana is benign, or, you know, it's okay for it to be legal, you know. It's almost the wrong message. I don't know. I'm just kind of worried about it. I mean, I don't mind. I'm not judging anybody. I smoke pot. I mean, you know, I don't anymore, but I did. I mean, I understand it. I understand what it's about, but I just don't think it was never. I think ought to be really careful about just saying this is legal, this is a good drug. And I know they love to compare it. Well, look at alcohol. Well, alcohol's no picnic either. I mean, you know, I'm not a big fan of alcohol and the damage it does to society. I mean, the number of things that goes on. So I mean, it's or you know, I was telling you before the show. I mean, you know, there was I was working with a client one time, and he sort of expressed. I forget how we were talking about it, but he was talking about it. You know, in his when he visited his grandmother, he wasn't allowed to smoke a cigarette. He would get yelled at, but he could have a glass of beer. And when he was a teenager, he was like 17, 16, you know, and it was okay, you know what I mean? And so I think culturally, you sort of decide what's okay and what's not okay. And you know, it's no longer okay in our society to smoke cigarettes. It's sort of like, you know, it's frowned on. You're not allowed to do it here, you're not allowed to do it there, this is not a good idea, you know. And so while at the same time we're doing that with tobacco, we're sort of saying, but this one's okay to smoke or eat or whatever you plan on doing with it. And this is a better drug. And it's not a better drug. I mean, you know, it's really not a better. I mean, maybe from a medical point of view, it's a safer drug, but not from a psychiatric point of view, that's for sure.
Yeah, and that was one of the points that got brought up as well, is that there's this perception of harm that plays a big role in this. And the idea that children are smoking less and less, you know, the public health campaigns, the money that was used from the tobacco lawsuits originally, that's helped to sort of increase the perception of harm around this, and it being an unsafe, you know, substance to use. And we can get that same message too. I mean, we're successful in decreasing the amount of drunk driving, for example, you know, with say, MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. But for some reason, those messages are not in place with things like marijuana right now.
Right. But we'll wait 10 years. So make them legal, and then we'll have disasters. No, I won't go there. I don't wish anybody ill, and I don't wish any disasters on anybody. I mean,
and again, I think it's and I've said this before, I think the idea of the legalization, it's a small issue. I mean, I won't say sort of minor issue.
We spend a lot of time on it.
We do, but they're the larger issues of, again, how do we make Vermont a vibrant place where youth can thrive and have other things to do besides getting high.
Right, but you know, they're going to talk about money, the revenue we get from taxes, or we're going to save the small farmer, or you know, we're going to have craft pot heads or craft pot shots, or enough of this. Listen,
we're going to be a broken record on
we're
this.
Going to do
People
this.
have heard what we think about this.
But one of the things, and again, I've asked you for this, and I talked to you, and I'm sort of interested in a lot of different ways. How do we develop, what do we need to do to have good mental health? What is it, when you think about, you know, physical health, you know, and maybe mental health too, you talk about diet, you talk about exercise, you talk about sleep, things like that, vaccinations, you know, taking care of yourself, you know, and all that. But what helps people develop better mental health? Is there things that people can do that sort of improve the quality of their life? I mean, do you have any suggestions or thoughts about that?
Absolutely, because I think, you know, one of the things is, you know, to be able to name the qualities of health or the characteristics of it, rather than saying it's simply the absence of being ill, right?
Right.
And what I'm often doing with my work is looking at a couple of things. I mean, one, there's a lot of literature about factors of resiliency. You know, how do we respond to stress and adversity? And also looking at things like quality of life, for example, along those lines, and what makes us happy. You know, so a vast array of literature out there that has actually looked at these issues, and a number of things that have come to the surface. I think we had Dr. Bennett on the show a while ago. We've had Mary Ellen Copeland with Wellness Recovery Action Programs. They've listed a lot of these sorts of things that help us to be well. I mean, having, of course, good relationships is really important. We're social animals. We need love. We need friendship. We need fellowship, and those are critical to us being well. So having, you know, healthy relationships with loved ones, with our family, coming in a warm, supportive home, being with people who bring, you know, say happiness or fill us with gratitude is really important. Sense of purpose is another thing as well. We're really sort of goal-driven in many ways, and having the sense that when I get up in the morning and I have something important to do is immensely important for people's happiness. One
of the things, and again, you know, when I was raising my daughter, and I wanted to raise her right, teach her right, and one of the things I was concerned about was how was I going to teach her religion, spirituality. I was no longer a practicing Catholic, and you know, and I didn't want my daughter to grow up without knowledge, without prayer, without God, without things. But at the same time, I was a little bit worried about the messages she would get. You know, you know, the message that she would get about herself, about her body, about whatever way she thought about her these issues as she became a teenager or an adult. I didn't want her to feel a sense of shame. I didn't want her to worry about sin or making judgments about it, things like that. But having said that, I've come to appreciate that I think spirituality is really important in the quality of life. And how people achieve that is really an individual quest. And one of the things that strikes me is that some people can live their life without a spiritual life, and they do fine. And I mean, really, they do fine. They think, well, I don't need it, I'm sort of okay. But I think for some people it makes a world of difference. And I think if you have a spiritual life, you'll notice it. You'll notice that, you know, the benefit of to take another point of view sometimes, to see the world differently, to sort of understand how we're all flawed, that we're not perfect, to, you know, I picked up a book in the library and I was reading it, and it had to do with revenge. So it was a whole book about revenge, and I said something to Maria, who was working at the library there, and I said, well, normally I'm more into forgiveness than revenge. You know, because when you lived a wrong life, you want to be forgiven and not, you know, held accountable. So I guess I wanted to mention that. I mean, when I think of good health, mental health now, one thing I've sort of gotten away from, and that was when we had like Robert Whitaker on and about his book, and we had a couple other folks on the book saying, you know, in some ways, we've made everything an illness, and maybe we've gone too far with some of this. And maybe we ought to just acknowledge that there's sadness, there's melancholy, there's feelings that we have, they're part of life. There's a way of feeling it. There's a way to dealing with things. So I guess I'm just trying to say that, you know, I remember as a parent trying to figure out for my daughter as I was raising her, just, you know, how do I teach her about life? What does she need to know? Like, you know, when you fall down, you get up again, you know what I mean? And I know that sounds like, well, that's how you teach them to ride a bicycle. But no, I mean, literally, you know, how do you teach them to understand that, you know, part of this getting well and feeling good about yourself is to acknowledge, you know, that it's not always going to be perfect. It's not always going to be, you know, that turned out the way you want it. And you don't have to be afraid of things. You don't have to be afraid of making a mistake. I mean, you don't have to be afraid that somehow things aren't going to go right, you know. So I was just wondering if you had some ideas about that or suggestions.
I agree with you completely. The idea that you know, regardless of whether it's a religion or spirituality, I think the sense that there's something greater than ourselves is really important. Even if it is just sort of mysticism about nature, or the idea that there's sort of a you know, sixth sense or a Gaia sort of philosophy, there's something bigger than we are, which is very much tied into sort of spirituality. And I think that's really essential. People who are extremely narcissistic, for example, are thought to have really sort of very low self-esteem and to be, you know, rather unhappy and fragile people. So I think if we, again, what you're talking about is developing these social connections, right, without fear and sort of an openness to chance.
And I think, you know, when I think about it, you know, and I have grandchildren, you know, what's my role with my grandchildren? I don't have to, you know, they have parents and they're good parents and they do what they do. And I think sometimes one of the roles of grandparents is that I can be old, I can look funny, I can talk funny, I can do things, and it doesn't, I don't judge them. And hopefully they don't judge me other than I'm like an old grandfather. But the idea of unconditional love, finding people who are not critical, who sort of just love you the way you are, you know what I mean? You know, and I guess that's not fair because I don't have to do discipline. I don't have to make them go to bed or anything like that. You know, I can just sort of hang out with them and watch what they're doing, you know. And I wonder about this. I just think there's so much disconnect, you know, and people not connected to others, people not talking to others. I don't know if that's part of it. I don't know if that's part of the, you know, I want to get stoned, or when I think about addiction, you know, there used to be these arguments that it was genetic because we had some good studies showing that it was genetic. But then other people say, no, it's more environmental and it's more social. It's a social learning model and stuff, you know. And I've really wrestled with it. Like, you know, what leads some people to drugs and alcohol? Is there some form of, and I hate to say mental illness, but is there something missing? And I've always thought that there was something missing for many people, and drugs and alcohol sort of take the place of it. And you never quite figure it out. I mean, if you start really young, you never quite figure that out. And I guess I just wonder, how do you teach that? How do you get people to understand what that is?
Yeah, because that's an important part. I think that with development, that is probably one of the major factors about people who are starting younger, getting into problems, is there's so much to do with your personal development and sort of who you are as a person, and learning how to make those peer relationships and later on the more intimate relationships that are part of our adult lives. And if we don't go through those processes, but we get rather sort of disconnected from them, then we're not able to develop well and to be happy functioning adults. And as you were talking about sort of your grandchildren and how do you sort of imbue them with this sense of, you're good enough, I started thinking about people being distracted. I mean, oftentimes as parents versus grandparents, we're more distracted by the work of providing for our families. We're more distracted with these sort of stressors. What is the future going to hold? And there's been some study that our happiness increases as we get older, because we stop being so distracted by these unknowns and what's going to happen and worrying about that. Whereas at a later stage in life, things are set. And we have this maturity that we can sort of hold a variety of emotions like happiness and sadness at the same time. For example, sort of the poignancy of shedding a tear and having a smile, looking at your grandchildren, realizing what just a joy that is and a sadness that they grow up, for example, and that you're in that moment.
One of the things, and this is something that's come up when I used to be a counselor, and one of the things that the AA would recommend to folks in early recovery is that they develop what they used to call a gratitude list. And they used to say, you need to have things that you're grateful for being sober for. And it's an interesting phenomenon. When you first start using drugs and alcohol, you get a lot of the benefits. You feel good, you have a social network. There's a lot of benefits to getting high. At least it seems that way. And most of the negatives of getting high are in the future. You don't get arrested every time you get high. You don't see all the damage that you're doing to relationships and everything. And only in time do you begin to see some of the negative consequences of using. And it's one of these funny things about the pros and cons of using. If you ask somebody at the beginning of their using, the benefits are pretty high and the negatives are pretty low. Now, on the other side of that, what is it like when you first get sober, which is the folks I used to work with. I used to work with people in the hospital. And what happens there is the negatives of getting clean and sober are pretty immediate. You lose your friends, you can't get high no more, you're often in trouble. There's a lot of negatives going on when people get clean and sober. Legal issues, whatever it might be. And the benefits, the benefits of getting clean and sober are delayed. They happen in the future. So you see that dilemma? When you're getting high, you get the benefits right away. The negatives come later. Getting clean and sober, the negatives are right in your face, and the benefits are sort of, you get them as time goes by. And one of the things that was so important, and it's come to mean a lot to me, is this idea of being grateful, is the idea of having gratitude in one's life. And they used to say, a grateful alcoholic is a sober alcoholic. If you're grateful for your recovery, if you're grateful for your sobriety, or for other things that you get in life, it reinforces the decision not to use. You know what I mean? And as you know, gratitude is just a huge issue.
Yeah, you were talking about how the pull or the immediacy of things that happen right now, the feeling good when you're first drinking, and then sort of all those consequences, is something that the behavioral economists called discounting the future. Because what happens is, because it's happening right now, it has a lot more weight to it than those things that possibly happen a long time in the future there. And so it's really natural to then discount those sort of things, because these things seem so much more important now. And how do you persist in sticking to that path that ultimately over time is going to be in your best interest? And I think this business about learning how to be grateful is an essential piece of that.
Right, because, believe it or not, sometimes when people first get sober and they have all those negative consequences, and a lot of bad stuff going on, what's the one memory they have? Well, when I got high, I used to feel better. And this used to work for me. Quite literally, that's the trap. And when we were talking about gratitude, and I was talking about it, there was this idea that, at Thanksgiving, people, sometimes we get together as a family, and you'll say, well, I'm grateful for this today, or I'm grateful for this in our family. Or there might be, at Christmas time or New Year's, you'll get these letters from families saying, here's what happened in our family, and we're grateful. But that almost seems like, well, once a year we're going to do this, we're going to talk about it. And yet my training, my understanding these days is that you want to be grateful every day. you want to understand that whatever you have every day, and you mentioned being, well, you're talking about me, getting older. No, and you are. I have friends, people my age are dying. I mean, I go to wakes, anyway, it's just a matter of truth. So it's a matter of sort of sometimes, and I mean, I hate to be so dramatic about it, but one, that I'm alive. And I continue to live, and my health is okay, not great, but okay. I'm sober, I mean, there's things that I count. There's things that I have. I have a life, I have a family, I have people that love me. These are all things that make the day worthwhile.
Yeah. And I think, notice too in our work, I think that gratitude seems to have been making the press a lot these days.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're referring to that column in the New York Times. Also on the TED Talks, which I really like, David Steidall, who is a Benedictine monk. But they talk about sort of how it's not that happy people are grateful, but grateful people are happy. And how do you bring that into your life? And as you were saying, this is not an exercise to be done once a year at Thanksgiving or major events, but rather the idea is that we have to find a way to stop ourselves in our daily lives. So sort of to stop and to realize, okay, I need to focus and look around, and there must be something here that is wonderful or that I can look at. And if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to develop gratitude and sort of appreciate our life as it is.
No, and I think that's one of the things with kids sometimes. You sort of, you're more aware of what's wrong with you. You're more aware that there's not something right about you. You're too short, you're too tall, you have pimples, I mean, whatever it might be. You're not doing well in school. I mean, there's always these things that sort of, I don't have a car, I don't have a job, I don't have a future. There's a lot of acknowledgement of what we don't have, of what's missing. And I don't think that you can make people be grateful, but I think sometimes not enough people acknowledge it. That they are grateful for what they have. They are grateful for being in America. You know what I mean? I mean, my mother was an immigrant. She loved America. She thought it was the greatest thing in the world. I mean, I'm not kidding you. It was like, this is America. It had freedom, and you can go places. You could go to education. You can go to school. You can make something of yourself. I think sometimes that's missing. I don't get that sense that sometimes people are just grateful to be alive and here and living where they live and living the life there. And I think that's kind of sad. I mean, maybe I'm not being good about this. Maybe I should recognize that there are people who are worse off, and it's more difficult. But boy, we were pretty poor, and my mother, our family, she was grateful.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, one of these things that they talk about too is, again, there's no reason to be grateful for violence and mistreatment.
Yeah.
But to be able to find something simple to be grateful about. I mean, this monk, Benedictine monk, was talking about putting a note on the faucet about the water. I mean, how amazing is that the water runs? I don't have to go to the stream to pull it up. That you can find these little pieces throughout the day. And his idea was that if we learn to be grateful, then we stop wanting so much, because this is really a problem. We want more of what we have, we want what somebody else has, and it creates a real gap between sort of what we expect and what we actually have. And that this then would lead to a point then where people would be grateful, better relationships, and without this wanting, with this sense of gratitude, then we should see a cascade towards having less violence and less harmfulness and all those negative things that keep people from being happy.
And the other thing that strikes me is that part of being grateful is giving to others, is sharing with others and doing what you can to be helpful to others. And if you can understand, if you can get to a place in your life where you can say, I'm grateful that I have an opportunity to help others. And boy, I'm telling you, you can always find ways of helping other people. There's always opportunities to do a little bit more, to do some act of kindness, or to do some. I think for a lot of times people think about gratitude as what do I have, when in some ways it's not what you have, it's what you've done for someone else. It's the opportunity to be helpful to someone.
Or maybe even not things that you have earned or worked for, but things that simply happen to be maybe undeserved gifts.
A gift that you receive, and a gift that you can share. Well, We haven't talked much about mental illness tonight, a little bit, but anyway, I hope people find this helpful on some level. So, good night, folks.